I want to begin with something uncomfortable. Most people in this country will work for 40 years. They will wake up early. They will stay late. They will answer emails after dinner. They will drag themselves through Mondays they stopped enjoying years ago. They will miss birthdays, skip weekends, absorb stress, solve problems for other people, and tell themselves that all of this strain must eventually amount to something. And at the end of it, many of them will have very little to show for it financially. Not because they were lazy, not because they were unintelligent, not because they lacked character, but because nobody ever sat them down early enough and told them the truth about how wealth actually works. That pool is not hidden in some vault. It is not a reserve for insiders. It does not require a Bloomberg terminal or a finance degree or an uncle who spent 20 years at Goldman Sachs. It is simpler than that, more elegant than that, and in a strange way, sadder than that, because the tragedy is not that wealth is impossible. The tragedy is that the engine of wealth is available in plain sight, and most people walk right past it for decades without fully understanding what they are leaving behind. So I want to talk about that engine. I want to talk about compounding, not as a slogan, not as a chapter in a textbook, not as one of those words people nod at politely and then forget as soon as the conversation turns back to their ordinary lives. I want to talk about it as the force that quietly separates one old age from another, the force that turns an ordinary income into dignity. If respected long enough, the force that gives patient people options that urgent people rarely receive. And I want to talk about it in a way that feels real, because most of the public discussion about compounding is too cold, too clean, too mathematical, and too bloodless to change anyone. S behavior, people hear the formula, they do not feel the cost of ignoring it. That is the mistake. Let me tell you about a perfectly ordinary decision. A young person, 22 years old, gets the first real paycheck of adult life, not the summer job check, not the part-time money, the first check that feels like proof of entry into the adult world. And what usually happens, the money is spent, not recklessly, not always, often quite reasonably. A nicer apartment because now you can finally afford to leave the old place. A better car because the old one embarrassed you or kept breaking down. Clothes appropriate for the new office. Furniture that makes your life look like the life you imagined adulthood would feel like. This is not insanity. This is exactly what most people do. It feels responsible. It feels deserved. It feels normal. That is why it is so dangerous. Because the danger in financial life rarely introduces itself as stupidity. Usually it introduces itself as normality. Here is what is actually happening beneath the surface when that first adult lifestyle starts expanding. Every dollar you spend at 22 is not only the dollar itself. It is that dollar plus everything that dollar would have become over the next 40 years if you had let it live instead of killing it. That is the part no one teaches hard enough. Most people see spending as subtraction. Compounding teaches you to see spending as forfeited multiplication. That is a completely different emotional experience. $100 spent today is not merely $100 gone. It is the future value of that $100 gone. And if you begin young enough and leave it alone long enough, that future value is often shockingly large. 15 times larger, 20 times larger, sometimes more. So the question is not only can I afford this purchase today? The deeper question is, what future am I quietly trading away in order to enjoy it now? That is a much more adult question. And adults who ask better questions usually end up living very different lives. Now, I am not here to tell you to live like a monk. I have no patience for theatrical deprivation. Money is not meant only to be stared at. Life must still be lived. You must still eat, love, travel when you can. Make memories, build a home, and have some joy. I am not preaching financial asceticism. I am asking for awareness, for proportion, for the ability to understand that every choice contains a hidden trade-off between present comfort and future strength. Because if you understood that trade-off deeply enough, not intellectually but emotionally, you would not become perfect. You would become different, and different is enough. Now let me explain compounding in the simplest way I know. Imagine an acorn, just one. You could hold it in your hand and think it is nothing. A small, hard thing, a forgettable object, easy to throw away, easy to lose, easy to dismiss because its value is invisible in the moment. But if you plant it, if you put it in the ground and leave it there, something extraordinary begins. At first, almost nothing. That is what confuses people. The first year gives you very little to admire. The 5th year still looks unimpressive to anyone who values speed. The 10th year finally begins to suggest that there was something meaningful in the acorn after all. The 20th year changes the scale of the thing. The 40th year silences. Everyone who once thought planting was a small act because now the tree is enormous, now it gives shade, now it stands, now it produces thousands of acorns of its own, and here is the part that should stop you in your tracks. The real act was done at the beginning. The planting happened once. Everything else was time multiplying that initial discipline, that is compounding. Money works the same way. You plant $1. It earns a return, then the return earns a return, then the return on the return earns another return. And very quickly, if time is long enough, you are no longer adding, you are multiplying. That is the part the human brain does not feel naturally. We are wired for straight lines. We understand 10 plus 10 plus 10. We do not instinctively grasp what happens when growth begins growing on itself. That is why compounding feels slow right up until the moment it starts looking miraculous. And by then, the people who ignored it are standing there saying they wish someone had explained it to them earlier. So let us make it painfully concrete. Two people, same age, same country, same rough starting line. 22 years old, same income, same basic intelligence. Different decision. The first person starts investing $200 a month as soon as adult work begins. Nothing exciting, no stock picking, no market timing, no performance theater. A simple, low-cost, broad market fund every month, no matter what. The second person says something. Most people say, I will start later. I want to enjoy my 20s. I need more room right now. I will get serious once things settle down. This does not make him irresponsible. It makes him normal. That is the whole point. At 32, he begins doing exactly the same thing. Same $200 a month, same broad market approach, same long-term logic. But by retirement age, the difference between them is staggering. The one who started at 22 can end up with multiple times the wealth of the one who waited until 32. Not because he was smarter, not because he took more risk, not because he found a better fund, because he gave compounding more years to work. Those 10 years at the front end, the years that looked least important, turned out to be the most valuable years in the entire sequence. This is one of the cruelest and most beautiful truths about money. The time when you feel least motivated to invest is often the time when investing matters most. When you are young, retirement looks absurdly far away. $200 a month feels large in the present and trivial relative to the future. That is exactly why so many people delay. And that delay costs them far more than they emotionally understand while they are making it. Now, if this were only a math problem, it would be easier. People could simply calculate, feel convinced, and act accordingly. But it is not a math problem. It is a behavior problem. That is what makes this so much harder. The arithmetic is elegant. The behavior is brutal. Let me tell you about Robert. Robert is fictional in one sense. In another sense, he is millions of people, middle manager, Ohio, decent salary, reasonable life, a 401k, because someone told him he would be foolish to leave the employer match on the table. A small brokerage account, because during the pandemic it looked as though everybody was making money, and he finally thought perhaps he should participate. Robert is not reckless. He has good intentions. Then March of 2020 arrives. The market falls with terrifying speed. The news sounds apocalyptic. Jobs are disappearing. Businesses are shutting down. The world feels like it is coming apart. Robert sits at his kitchen table, watches his account drop by sums that feel viscerally painful, and makes a decision that, in that moment, feels intelligent. He sells. He moves to cash. He tells himself he will get back in when things feel stable again. And this is the part that matters. The market begins recovering almost immediately after he sells. Then it keeps recovering. Then it moves above the old highs. And Robert, who thought he was preserving his future, ends up missing one of the strongest recoveries in modern history. Now, Robert is not stupid. He is not weak. He is human. That is what people must understand. Financial mistakes are so often human mistakes, not mathematical ones. Fear does not feel like fear when you are in it. It feels like prudence. It feels like intelligence. It feels like action. It feels like refusing to stand in the burning building while everyone else insists the fire may pass. That is why it is so expensive. Because panic always comes disguised as reason. The market does not care how frightened you are. The market does not care how closely you watch the headlines. The market does not reward the person who felt the most danger most intensely. It rewards with almost cruel consistency the person who can remain seated when every instinct says run. That is the real skill, not analysis alone, not intelligence alone, temperament, patience, the ability to feel terror and still refuse to dismantle a sensible long-term plan. I do not say this casually. It is extraordinarily hard. Watching your net worth fall is not an abstract exercise. It is biological. The nervous system experiences it. The body experiences it. A person with real money on the line does not sit there like a philosopher detached from outcomes. He feels it. The difference is what he does with the feeling. That is why I always cared more about temperament than brilliance in markets, because brilliance without emotional stability turns into sabotage. Now here is the truth that helps. If you let it, downturns are not anomalies. They are part of the design. The American stock market has suffered crashes, recessions, wars, financial scandals, depressions, bubbles, political chaos, and full-blown crises across the last century. And through all of that, the broad, long-term trend has remained upward, not in a smooth line, not in a painless line, but upward. The question is never whether a downturn will come. The question is whether you will stay invested long enough for the upward part to still belong to you when it arrives. Most people do not. That is why they underperform the very market they claim to participate in. They sell, they wait, they demand reassurance. They keep trying to convert a long-term machine into a short-term comfort device. It does not work. Now, there is another layer to this that almost no one explains properly. The relationship between wealth and time, not market time, lifetime. Most people think about money in the present tense, checking account, paycheck, credit card due date, mortgage, next month. They think in cycles of immediate management. That is understandable. The world trains people to live like that, but it is expensive. Truly wealthy people, or people becoming wealthier with quiet intention, eventually begin thinking of money differently. They think of it as directional. They think in futures, not fantasies, futures. What is this dollar worth in 10 years if planted? What is this spending habit worth in 20 years if repeated? What is this automated contribution worth in 30 years if left alone? That is when behavior changes. A daily $20 lunch no longer feels like only $20. It feels like today's pleasure plus 30 years of foregone multiplication. That does not mean you must never enjoy lunch. It means you stop seeing money as a present resource only and begin seeing it as a living stream, not a pool, a river. Something moving toward a destination, whether you are paying attention or not. That mental shift changes everything. Now let me tell you about Linda. Linda is 53, a nurse, mid-sized southern city. No glamorous income, no family office, no hedge fund husband, no magical inheritance. She spent much of her early adult life doing what many women in this country did and still do, holding everything together: children, bills, transport, school, food, survival. There was no elegant 20-something phase in which she had spare money for index funds and abstract future security. She was busy keeping life functioning. So when people speak carelessly about how everyone should have started at 22, I think of people like Linda, because life is often much messier than theories, but somewhere in her mid-30s, after a little stabilization, after the children were slightly older after the month pressure eased just enough to create a crack of air, she began, not heroically small, $50 a month. Later $100, through the employer plan, because it was available and simple and did not require her to become a market intellectual. She did not time anything. She did not trade. She did not become the sort of person who talks about macro cycles at dinner. She contributed month after month, year after year, without drama, without flair, without a story to impress strangers. Linda will probably never look rich in the way modern culture defines it, but Linda will retire with something I consider far more important than image. Dignity. Options enough. That matters, because compounding does not require perfection. It requires presence. It requires that you keep showing up long enough for time to notice you. That is what most people miss. They think they need the perfect amount, the perfect start, the perfect confidence number. They need enough consistency that the machine can begin doing what machines do. Now I want to ask you something directly. Where are you in this story? Are you 20-something with the most valuable financial resource on earth and almost no emotional sense of what you are holding? Are you in your 30s or 40s and beginning to feel the slight panic of realizing that delay is no longer theoretical? Are you older, running the numbers, wondering whether your choices added up to enough, or whether you still have time to change the ending? Wherever you are, the answer is the same. The best time was earlier. The second best time is now. That phrase becomes cliché because it is true often enough to survive repetition. The thing you cannot purchase later is time. Not with more effort, not with more intelligence, not with more regret. Time does not compound in your favor if you postpone. That is why delay is usually more expensive than error. A person who begins imperfectly often beats the person who waits intelligently. That is the nature of the machine. So if you are waiting, I want you to understand what gets in your way. It is probably not information. There is enough information already: books, podcasts, videos, threads, courses, articles, enough material to drown a person. Information is not the bottleneck. Emotion is the bottleneck. Fear, greed, impatience. The emotional machinery that keeps pulling long-term capital decisions back into short-term human discomfort. Fear tells you to sell when prices fall. Greed tells you to chase whatever rose last year. Impatience tells you that if you are not getting rich fast, you must be doing it wrong. The financial industry often encourages all three because all three generate activity. Activity generates fees. A quiet person who buys broad exposure and sits still for 40 years is not especially profitable to the people selling excitement. That is why one of the most valuable financial acts of adulthood is to stop reacting, not to stop caring, to stop reacting. Build a simple plan, diversify sensibly, contribute automatically, leave room for emergencies, then defend the plan from your own nervous system. That is a grown man's work. Now I want to change one thing in how you see the market itself. Stop thinking about it as a flashing board of prices. Your job is to outguess. Start thinking about it as partial ownership of the productive engine of the country. The businesses, the goods, the services, the logistics, the tools, the ingenuity, the ordinary miracle that a civilization keeps building, adapting, improving, and selling despite politics, despite recessions, despite scandals, despite war, despite human foolishness. That is what a broad index really is. Not a ticker, a claim on productivity. That is why I have always thought the broad market is one of the most rational bets available to ordinary people. You are not betting on one genius. You are not betting on one story. You are betting that over long enough periods, human beings keep finding ways to create value. History suggests this is a very good bet, and here is the beautiful part. Compounding does not only reward the already rich, it especially changes the lives of ordinary people who begin with little. The nurse saving $50, the graduate automating $200, the immigrant family setting aside what they can whenever they can because they know something deep in their bones about building slowly. Compounding does not require aristocratic beginnings. It rewards repetition. That is why I respect it so much. It is one of the few engines in modern life that does not sneer at small beginnings. Now, let me give you the emotional structure of this in the clearest possible form. There are two people listening right now. The first understands all of this, nods, feels the truth of it for an hour, then returns to ordinary life unchanged, keeps spending without directional thought, keeps postponing serious action, keeps believing some later, calmer, more mature version of himself will handle this. And then slowly the years do what years do. They pass, he reaches later life with less than he hoped and more regret than he thinks he deserves. The second person feels the same discomfort, the same lateness perhaps, the same recognition that earlier would have been better. But instead of turning that feeling into self-criticism, he turns it into action. He plants the acorn, maybe not perfectly, maybe not with the ideal amount, maybe he misses some months, maybe the market scares him at times, maybe his progress is uneven, but he begins, mostly he stays. And if he stays long enough, one day he looks up and realizes something has changed. Not extravagance, not fantasy wealth, security, calm, that low, quiet kind of strength that comes when the account no longer feels fragile. When one broken appliance or one ugly month or one frightening headline does not immediately threaten the whole structure of life. That is what compounding does to ordinary lives. It does not always make them glamorous. It makes them durable. And durability is one of the most underrated forms of wealth in the world. The ability to remain standing when lesser systems break is a kind of fortune all its own. I want you to hold on to that because too many people imagine wealth only in its loudest form. Luxury, excess, status display. I have seen enough life to know those things are often overrated. What is not overrated is room to breathe, room to say no, room to retire without panic, room to help a child, room to absorb an emergency, room to choose. That is what compounding buys the ordinary person. Not always yachts options. And options are often what make the difference between a life that feels trapped and a life that feels self-directed. So here is what I want to leave you with. The oak tree is slow. It does not apologize. It does not perform. It does not ask whether the world finds its pace. Exciting, it grows. That is all. But one day it becomes the largest thing in the yard. The same is true of compounding. It is slow enough to be mocked by the impatient, quiet enough to be ignored by the distracted, plain enough to be underestimated by the clever. Then, if respected, it becomes enormous. And by the time it is enormous, the people who once dismissed it are usually telling themselves they wish they had started when the act still looked small. So start. If you are young, start. If you are late, start. If you are scared, start small and keep starting. If you have made mistakes, do not turn them into an identity, turn them into a beginning. Time will pass anyway. Let's pass in your favor. Plant the acorn. Stay the course. Trust what grows slowly. That is the most honest thing I know to tell you about wealth.